Hi everyone, good morning and welcome to this session of a discussion. It's very pertinent discussion, mass movement and transitional justice in Africa. I think this discussion couldn't have come at a more at a more relevant time, especially looking at the context in Africa from the last 5 years. We are now seeing more youth involved in activism around the continent. I think from my perspective, growing up in Cameroon, I grew up in a culture of protest. So when there's no water, we protest. When there's no electricity, we protest. So it's more of a culture which we are now seeing. Maybe we can take it from a borrowed French culture, but it's something we are now seeing cutting across the continent. We look at the End SARS protests in Nigeria, which it really went global. I think that's one of the first protests in Africa, which for this our generation to have really experienced. The Arab Spring had happened before a long time, like maybe 15 years ago, but this one happened when we were adults. We could think for ourselves. We could really understand. We have seen the Gen Z protests in Kenya, and this now brings us to the discussions on mass movements and transitional justice in Africa. And this did not just start today. Over the years, in search for its economic and political liberation, dating from the colonial period, Africa has been a hotspot for mass movement, and these movements have shaped the continent's political, social, and economic landscape. Some of these movements eventually forced the hand of the imperialists to grant us independence. Most of us who did history in ordinary level, advanced level, we studied subjects like African nationalism, where we learned of the nationalist movements in Nigeria, in Kenya, the rebellions in Cameroon, in Ghana. Our independence was hard fought. It was a product of this mass movement. However, in contemporary times, these mass movements, they are not responding to the ills of colonialism, but they are more or less responding to neo-colonialism, and they also emerge as responses to systemic injustice, human rights violations, and manifest failures in governance. So some of these notable movements have included like the apartheid in South Africa, and I think some of us would know that until is it 2008, Nelson Mandela and some of the leading figures of the apartheid movement in South Africa were still considered terrorists by the American government. But these were mass movements which were framed as liberation movements, but from the opposition, they were considered terrorists. We have seen the Arab Spring which swept across Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya between 2010 to 2011, the Sudan Revolution, which ran from 2018 to 2019, the Burkina Faso uprising in 2014. And these last two mass movements, the Sudanese Revolution and the Burkina Faso uprising, they resulted in the removal of two long-standing presidents in Sudan and Burkina Faso, respectively. More recently, we have seen the End SARS movement in Nigeria, and the Gen Z movement also in Kenya. So, what we're out to discuss today is how have these mass movements, how do they impact governance structures in Africa, especially with their relationships with transitional justice? Because it seems traditional justice mechanisms, they offer potential pathways for addressing the grievances which spark this mass movement. These mass movements don't just erupt from nowhere. They are as a result of underlying grievances. So we have two expert panelists here who are going to usher us into the discussions. We are going to engage in very in insightful discussions on how transitional justice mechanisms can respond to the underlying grievances which occasion mass movements. So our first panelist is Mr. Martin Mavenjina, a constitutional and human rights lawyer and advocate of the High Court of Kenya, currently serving as senior program advisor for transitional justice at the Kenya Human Rights Commission. He's a leading voice on accountability, civic space and protection, and transitional justice in contexts marked by political violence, protest movements, and repression. He has extensive experience with the intersection of mass mobilization and justice reform. And Martin has been at the forefront of documenting, litigating, and advocating for accountability for serious human rights violations. He has also led national coalitions addressing extrajudicial executions and enforced disappearances during periods of civic unrest. His leadership contributed to key legislative milestones in Kenya, including the Prevention of Torture Act of 2017 and the National Coroner Service Act of 2017. So at the regional level, Martin has also engaged with human rights mechanisms such as the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, the Universal Periodic Review, the Assembly of State Parties, and the UN Human Rights Council. And his work also critically examines how mass movements generate demands for structure, for structural reform, and how transitional justice mechanisms like truth seeking, reparations, prosecution, and institutional reform can respond effectively in politically sensitive environments. Thank you very much for being with us here, Martin. Thank you so much. And we hope to have a very
Thank you.
engaging conversation with you. Our other panelist is Wanasa Ahmed. I would call her Miss Activism. In preparation for for this discussion, I literally went to Google and I looked at who Mwanase Ahmed is, and you can literally find documentaries on YouTube about this lady. This lady has protested all over the world. She is a leading activist in Africa, and I really call on our young ladies on this webinar to look up to her as a role model, look up to Martin, and look up to Manessa. Engage them on LinkedIn, follow them, follow their work, and I think this is also a very important avenue for mentorship and collaboration. So Manessa has lived. She's Kenyan and has lived across the world, from the United States to France to Senegal and to Central America. As a young lady, she was drawn to activism, marching in protests, questioning systems, and finding her voice in the chaos of the street. So when she returned to Kenya, she focused on community and impact, from building sustainable ecologies in Kilifi to coaching kids, writing policies, hosting dialogue forums, and rallying youth across counties. She is fondly known as the co-founder and former CEO of Distant Relatives Ecolodge and Backpackers in Kilifi, which became a model for community-first, environmentally conscious tourism in Africa. She has sat on advisory councils, worked with county governments, trained women leaders, led fundraising drives, organized protests, and created safe spaces for healing and resistance. Mwanasi has also spoken on international stages and continues to lend a voice to movements pushing for justice, equity, and unity across the continent. She has faced several challenges like being arrested, followed, and threatened, but she still remains determined to show up and fight for justice. In one of the the YouTube documentaries I was watching about Mwanasi, I think one of the first the first statement she made was, "I can never live in a society which fight for the 1%, rather for the 99%." And that really struck with me. And in most African contexts, one of the main reasons for mass movements is because we, the Gen Zs or the population, are rejecting the status quo. The status quo, which seeks to undermine us, which seeks to protect the 1% at the expense of the 99%. So, with that, I would like us to start on the issue of political transitions. So, we have seen popular protests which have led to the fall of governments across Africa, from Sudan to Burkina Faso. What makes some of these moments lead to real change while others end up going backwards, like we want to do? Because we'll see that sometimes the mass movements will occasion a revolution, which will maybe in at the top orchestrate a change at the top, but we don't see these in-depth changes across these countries. Why would you think so? So first, I would like to give the floor to Martin before we look at the perspective of Manasseh. Thank you so much, Martin.
You're on mute, Martin.
Thank you, Dr. Bourbon, for that, that really flattering introduction and that excellent question. Let me begin by saying, allow me to begin by saying that mass movements may be popular in our generation right now, but we must remember that our forefathers, or those who fought for the liberation struggles of most of our countries, actually did participate in mass movements, albeit in different forms, and that may explain why many African countries were liberated from the yoke of colonialism, and that is why we kind of have a semblance of independence. But specifically to your question as to why some of these movements have led to real change, while others end up backward, and end up taking us backward. In certain instances, we have seen we have seen instances whereby the youth or the youth of today have led successful movements that have actually brought about regime change. But in doing that, they have got rid of the political elites, but they have not. We have not seen structural changes within the institutions that are supposed to actually hold them to account. So in that instant, that is the first reason as to why we have not been able to see fundamental change that's been brought about by mass movement in certain instances. Uh, the second argument I would like to advance is, and just to clarify, or basically to exemplify my first point, you did mention Sudan, and yes, we did see then President Omar al-Bashir removed through mass movement by citizens. But as we are all aware, we are being given lip service today that he's facing some semblance of accountability. Yet we all know Omar al-Bashir has been indicted for crimes against humanity. He should have been actually a humble resident of The Hague, but well, alas, he's somewhere. Yeah, we're actually not sure if there's any form semblance of justice. So the argument I'm trying to make is that in as much as sometimes we do have citizens giving rise to fundamental change, when when there's no goodwill from whoever takes over, then you end up with a situation whereby the same perpetrators are actually left scot-free. The second point I want to make is around instances where we've seen, the military come in, to take over, can I say, to come in and, take charge of a situation as a result of mass movements. And in most of these instances, of course, many have argued that military leaders all over Africa who have taken advantage of popular mass initiatives by citizens have taken advantage of the situations and have actually promised citizens a lot of, to hold past leaders to account, to ensure that governments, serve their citizens. But we have seen them quickly getting very comfortable in in these positions of leadership. Of course, some may argue that President Traore, Ibrahim Traore, is probably the only exception. But when you look at the other military leaders all over Africa who have taken advantage of sustained pressure by mass movements, then you realize that they have got into power, they have normalized their stay in power, of how held, can I say, sham elections, trying to now prove that they are the legitimate leaders that the citizens want, and that's what they aspire to do. And then the third point that I'd want to advance is now to look at the other side of your question, which was to do with what makes some of these moments lead to real change. So what has actually the first point was to say that what has brought about significant change in some of the jurisdictions within Africa is probably the length of time that some of these leaders have been, and coupled with the fact that the youth of today or the citizens of today are more alive to their rights, and they are more aware of what obligations their leaders should do to them, and they have just said enough is enough. We are not going to take this, because we all have to remember that leadership in Africa is supposed to be servant leadership. So none of our leaders are actually a blessing to us. No, we vote them, or we present ourselves to serve for and on behalf of our citizens. So because we have a conscious citizenry in Africa, that is why we have seen most of these movements bring about significant change. The other instance, in certain instances, we have seen mass movements have been successful primarily as a result of the pressure that is brought about by regional blocs. And by that, I would cite an example of when Yahya Jammeh lost the presidential election in some years, a couple of years ago, and he actually wanted to cling on to power, and Sadat was like, no, 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 you will, not Sadat, but ECOWAS was like, you have to leave or we will intervene militarily. And because there was a popular understanding amongst Gambians that they did not want him in power, he was beaten fair and fair in an election. So in certain instances, we have seen regional blocs exert pressure on incumbents, or we have seen them intervene in specific situations. And then lastly, as I conclude, and let Manasseh weigh in, is we've also seen sustained pressure from uh, uh, different peer review mechanisms that have put a certain, that put sustained pressure on certain countries. And by peer review mechanisms, I mean the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, and the different UN organs and the special mandate holders have put sustained pressure, and this in one way or another has directly or indirectly contributed or accelerated mass significant change. And as I conclude, we have seen also some instances where certain countries have actually, issued travel bans on certain individuals. So that, in one way or another, has left them with no option but to yield to the sustained pressure that, as a result of mass movements. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you very much, Martin. And as you were speaking, like three things, I think I'll not say three things, but a few things are coming to mind. You made mention of leaders coming to power on the back of mass movements and holding sham elections. And you made mention of the role of this, should I say, the regional bodies in ensuring that the ideals of the mass movement are concretized in the next republic which comes. I'm coming to you now, Ahmed. This is a very similar question to what I asked.
You seem to have gone on to mute by mistake.
Sorry, mistake. So I want to look at it from the perspective of a movement has succeeded. So they have succeeded in removing a leader. We take example from the Arab Spring. We look at the examples from Egypt. We look at Tunisia. These countries had successful mass movements which turned into revolutions, and the leaders were removed. How I don't want to say how do we, because it has already happened, but we're looking now from a futuristic perspective. So how do we ensure that justice and reform actually become a part of what comes next rather than getting pushed aside? I think that's very important because we have mass movements, we have leaders who come on the backs of those mass movements, but then they, should I say, they do a counter revolution. They shift back to the status quo. Justice and reform are something of the past. They come under the only thing which changes is the name of the leader, but the system remains the same. How do we ensure that justice and reform are what comes next after a mass movement, after a leader has been removed? We look at the examples of Burkina Faso. Blaise Compaoré was removed, but the system has still stayed the same. There has been no justice, there has been no reforms. We look at the Arab Spring, Egypt. This is not me speaking. This is Freedom International. These are their reports. So what should we do to ensure that the next mass movement that comes in Africa, because it's going to come, the next mass movement which comes in Africa, which occasions the removal of a leader, how do we ensure that there is a more systemic change in the institutions and in the reforms, not just a change in leader?
Thank you. Thanks for the question. And I believe that ultimately it's very difficult because a lot of these mass movements tend to be transitioned by elite pacts, where the political class who have come in with bargaining power take over, have their personal and kind of cabal or their own interests served in the transition, and the needs, the demands of the people are lost and are brushed aside. And so when we've looked at some of these mass transitions, we see a gap, a power vacuum from the youth, the working class who are protesting and building on the mass movement, which creates space for it to be captured. And for power to be taken by, as you said, just another leader who doesn't necessarily have the same values, the same intentions, or the same integrity. So I think that's a very difficult question to ask, bearing in mind that right now it's very clear that there is no such thing as international law. There's no human rights laws. There's no continental or regional bodies that haven't been corrupted, bought out, sold out. If we look at the African Union, we look at the East African Union, East African Community, there's so much political goodwill between it's hard to call them leaders, between those who have stolen power of our countries, because they are ultimately looking at their own financial interests. So their diplomatic relations with other countries are based around their personal financial interests. And I say personal because generally these bilateral agreements and engagements should benefit the broader citizenry, not just the political class or the leaders. So when there's impunity and when there's lack of accountability, when rule of law has been suspended in many countries, both locally, regionally, and also internationally, and these mass violations and atrocities go unchecked, because there's a lack of interest, maybe too many ongoing issues, and a lack of any teeth or backbone in these structures that are meant to oversee governance, the democratic space, freedoms and rights, human rights. It creates a space where it's very difficult to find justice and to find accountability. So ultimately, I think it's really important to look at all avenues for justice and accountability. How do we work outside of the norms when when this is the kind of scenario that you're facing? Ultimately, I think it's about exploring any and all avenues, from local to regional to international, and to like very grassroots based solutions for accountability. We've seen pressure, we've seen judiciaries and, executive and local parliaments and local courts be completely compromised. We've seen mass delays in regional courts like the East African Court of Justice, more than 5 years, 10 years, or even rulings be made, but they're never implemented. And I would say it's similar with the African court. So how do we continue to put pressure on these mechanisms to actually also fulfill their mandates while also escalating to other international avenues? We've seen the pressure that sanctions can also create universal jurisdiction on certain people when we're looking at how do we attack their assets, freeze their assets, ban their mobility. And also the ICC, it's not a all-in-one solution, but it does create fear when cases do get opened and launched. It does come with a lot of repercussions as well and potential violence. So ultimately, I think we cannot allow for all of these regional, continental, and local systems to be completely captured. We need to find alternative methods, naming and shaming, advocacy, petition, lawsuits against individuals, looking at the financiers and the enablers and what is the chain propping up these individuals and the institutions, and keep building multifaceted strategies to seek justice.
Thank you so much, Ahmed. And while you were speaking, something kept on coming to my head. You said we need to find alternative spaces, alternative avenues to hold government accountable. That being said, I think most of us here have a background in law, and we know for a fact this is it's not an opinion. The greatest violator of human rights in every state is the state itself. From a systemic level, it's the state itself. So where we find instances where the state is unwilling to hold its own self accountable, and within the context of what you have just said, where we are living in a vacuum where there's seemingly no international law, we have no idea what international law is, what it ought to be, or what it should be anymore. I think everything we have known has been flipped on its head. So then we find ourselves in situations where we cannot call on the international community, because what is the international community then? What are their interests? So we cannot call on them from that perspective to put pressure on the state to ensure, to call for accountability. So this is a question now. It's for you both. Given this context, to how have mass movements pushed for truth telling about past abuses, and if there are any known examples, maybe we could engage on them. And given that most protests in Africa they die down very soon, it's I, one thing I've noticed in Africa, it's from my perspective, we do not have the ability to sustain protests for a very long time. Maybe we need to do more research, or maybe there's research which has been done which answers that question, and I haven't read about it. We do not have the ability to sustain protests for very long. So when the protests they die down, and the movement ends. Like what then? Like what do we expect? Because the government will not always welcome the calls for truth. Then we have this protest, which the protests don't even go anywhere after maybe 1 month, 2 months, and everything goes back to as you were. So what happens? What happens to this movement? What happens to the calls for protests? What happens? Like, is there now where an international community which is now non-existent? So this is this dilemma which would like you to help us unpack. How does all of this situate itself within the context of truth, justice, and reconciliation? How can we have truth about these past abuses, given this current international framework? Given this current situation where mass movements often die down very fast, given this context where governments do not always welcome calls for truth, how do we then juggle this with the search for truth? So maybe Ahmed, you could just continue since you're in the same line of train thought, and then we'll have the Martin finish the question.
Thank you. I also just wanted to add one thing about, why are these protests dying down and why are they not being sustained? Because sometimes when we look at it, we seem to blame the movement. But ultimately, I think there's some key factors that kill them. One is like disappearance and targeting of leadership. You have extrajudicial killings, you have abductions, you have enforced disappearances, you have torture, arbitrary arrests, you have, the disqualification or shutting down of organized groups. You have a lot of violence and threats. For example, if you look at what recently happened in Tanzania, the violence was premeditated, mass, huge weapons, like, beyond military grade weapons that were brought in, and thousands of people were shot and hunted down in their homes and murdered, not even the opposition or the protesters. So huge amounts of violence and threats over military deployment, as we've noted, neglect to rule of law, and a lack of organized structure for transitioning political power, which I think Martin also touched on. But you also have burnout and exhaustion. So I think a lot of the questions we also need to look at is how can we sustain them when we're up against such challenging repercussions, backlash, violence. So I think that's also an important question to unpack. So I just wanted to add that comment into the why as we then look at how do we move past this. I think what I could say as one recent example, I think I could just bring it into the case of Tanzania. So with Tanzania, we knew that all international observers had been shut out from coming in. International media had been shut out. Local media houses had been blocked from airing what was happening. There was a huge call for a protest instead of the election because there had been no reforms. So there was no reforms, no election. Um, People were being disappeared, but we knew that there was going to be an internet shutdown. There was already banning of certain social media platforms. Local media were not allowed to air things, and other media weren't allowed in. So we knew there was going to be a huge blackout in terms of information. And so to be able to amplify the truth, capture what was happening, we actually set up some systems to be able to get information out of Tanzania into Kenya. And we're doing kind of every 3 to 4 days press briefings where we would share a folder of information, facts from the ground, video, photo evidence, and sharing it with media houses locally and internationally to help amplify the truth and not let it happen behind closed doors. So there's still a lot of ongoing efforts into setting up that truth commission. I would just say that the people's movements also are not organized. And when I say resource, it's human resource, it's finance, it's all of it in the same level of the states. So it makes it very difficult to move as quickly as them. But I believe also we need to look at how movements morph. For example, I think in Kenya, one of the things there was, a lot of challenges, which I've already highlighted, which led to it dying down and sellouts and, elite pacts once again coming in who represent the people and say they represent their interests, but then forget about all of their interests. So it's kind of like capture and infiltration of movements. But then it was also the recognition that even if we're getting the CSs fired and our demands are being met, the current government is not going to lead or implement the change that we need. So actually, we do need to reorganize and re-strategize for transition of political power instead of trying to hold a system of gangsters accountable for their crimes? How do we do that while also organizing for a broader transition of political power, which, due to the violence and suppression, didn't seem feasible in that time as it has been for other mass movements? Um, I do believe that nothing is erased. When we look at human rights violations, when we look at resource theft of resource, misuse of public resources, capture of state resources, all of this can be traced. A lot of the perpetrators are very well known. So I believe once we can actually strengthen some of the oversight institutions, transition some leadership and have some leadership of integrity within these bodies, it allows you to actually integrate truth and justice mechanisms even for past abuses. I'll stop there for now and allow Martin to share his thoughts.
Thanks, Manasseh, and thanks, Dr. Babin, for that wonderful question. And I'll just pick up from where Manasseh said. Now, uh, allow me to start by saying, uh, before most of our countries obtained independence from their colonial masters, at the height of all this, they did negotiate. There was some form of negotiation. If you look at the history of most of our countries, and that's what ensured that they actually got independence and were actually to be able to move forward, albeit, still stained with, a few relics of, still stained with a few relics of colonialism. Now, when you come to, the current state of affairs, I think the most important step is first and foremost to ensure that transitional justice is infused directly into political transition processes. And Manasseh spoke about, coming up with, a transitional process of some sort. So once you infuse, transitional justice within these, transition processes, then it kind of ensures that, there will be some semblance of accountability. There could be some semblance of constitutional reforms or transition within the government, depending on the context. So anywhere within the continent, you could even see a situation where there are agreements of some sorts that are entered. So say peace agreements. But more importantly, I think what all this should entail is an aspect or semblance of accountability, because uh, most of the most of the successful mass movements that we've seen in recent years that have actually brought about fundamental change, or have got away with, should I say, repressive leaders, have always demanded for that aspect of accountability. So if you have transition without accountability, then the same mistakes would be committed again. The same violations, should I say, not even mistakes, but violations would be committed, say, by those who are sent into power. So those are some of the elements that I think should be within like a transitional framework, and those are properly usually captured within the transitional justice framework. Now, the other thing, the other second point that I wanted to make is that in order for we must ensure that the mass movements must be strong and basically they have to ensure that there's strong and sustained civic engagement, and this is essential because, like Manasseh said, many of these mass movements usually die down, and you also alluded to that, Dr. Babin, that they usually die down after some time. So, and that is primarily because sometimes when you get rid of the regime of the day, or you get rid of the powers that be, then people go back to, life, they go back to life as usual. But usually because of the absence of a transitional plan, because of the absence of, a clear plan of reform within the critical institutions, then you end up having, the same leaders coming up with you end up having a different set of elites taking over power, but the same leaders. So it is important to ensure that while we transition, while mass movements contribute to transition, they must anchor in, the key fundamental aspects of transitional justice. They must ensure that there are institutional reforms, be it within the judiciary, be it within within the governance structure. But more importantly, we should have people's truth commissions. And the reason why I'm saying we should have people's truth commissions is because in the past we have seen successful mass movements. We have seen the governments of the day commission, institute commissions of inquiry. But usually what has happened is that you find most of the findings and the recommendations of these commissions are actually handed over probably to the executive or the relevant legislative arms of this in our jurisdictions, and these reports end up gathering dust. A case in point I would cite is, in Kenya, we did have the Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission report. We even had the Waki report that were all instituted as a result of the post-election violence of 2007. And these reports came up with broad recommendations on how they would ensure that there was accountability, there was reforms within the government structures, within the security apparatus, and it all aimed at holding perpetrators to account. But your guess is as good as mine. Those reports are still gathering dust. Our legislators have debated over its contents, and there's I can say there's generally a lack of political will within Africa to actually implement the recommendations of these truth commissions. However, if we had a People's Truth Commission, after you successfully remove these repressive leaders from power, or you bring about fundamental change, a People's Truth Commission would ensure that actually some of these recommendations are actually ably implemented. So that is what we would use to hold the next crop of leaders who come and who come and serve citizens continentally. So I thought I should mention that. So, and then thirdly, I think it is also important. It's important to try to see how to continuously engage the youth, because we do realize that if you look at the history of mass movements in Africa, the movements that are being done by our youth today are totally different from what our forefathers did. So it is my honest opinion that probably it's important and critical to continue conducting civic education to ensure that youth are more interested in how their countries are governed. And if you inculcate, if we try to, if we sustain a culture of inclusivity of, youth and participation of the youth in governance affairs of different of different countries, then in that way you would ensure that actually that the significant results that have been achieved by these mass movements are actually sustained, and that we did not go back to a situation whereby we do have mass movements that are successful, but we don't they're successful, but we don't keep on uh, dealing with the critical cancer that keeps becoming a problem for all of us. I'll leave it at that.
I think Manasseh has a hand up.
Yes.
I just wanted to add something, because when we look at people's truth commissions or the government truth commissions, and we see people being hunted down, disappeared, even who come in front of the government's fake kind of tokenistic commissions, when we start thinking about alternatives for justice, I just wanted to build on that a little bit, because I personally think the political class's lives need to be made so uncomfortable, and maybe this is not a popular opinion for lawyers, but make their lives just as uncomfortable as that of the citizenry. We had a trend in Kenya of kusalimia, as we called it, which is where perpetrators and individuals, their details were shared, and people would just continuously speak to them, bombard them, and make their existence actually so uncomfortable? Why is it that we have community created justice systems for robbers and thieves, because we know that the traditional quote unquote justice systems with police and courts are ineffective and corrupt? So we have community justice systems that look at accountability and sometimes a lot of violence against perpetrators because there are no other avenues for justice, which makes an example out of them, which deters other people from doing it. So in the absence of any working systems of justice, we also need to find a bit drastically different alternative systems that can mean that their life in their communities, their normal existence, is just as uncomfortable of those who they're oppressing. And I think I'll leave it up to the audience to determine, in their own context, what does that look like? What could that look like? How do we publicly name and shame? How do we push them out of spaces that they feel comfortable in, online, physically, in communities? And what do actual community justice systems look like? If you're dealing with people who have directed the murder of many innocent citizens or been negligent of provision of social services, which leads to mass atrocities and mass death, what is justice? What does it look like? And how can we reinvent that on our own terms when systems locally, regionally, internationally are failing us? So I think that's food for thought and to be considered within our various spaces.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. It seems you have now brought us to the next segment of our discussion on the issue of promotion of accountability and justice. And in Martin's concluding statements, he made mention of the critical role you'd have to play in promoting this justice and accountability. Now, Manasseh, you were speaking about alternative measures, making the lives of the 1% as uncomfortable as possible. So I'm trying to marry these three things together. And I think the easiest way for me is to create a contrast between two protests, which I think my generation witnessed within the last, I would say 5, 6 years. So we look at the NSAS protests in Nigeria, for instance. It's, I think, from being an adult, like, and how old was I? Like maybe 25, having a certain reasoning faculty, I could maybe understand the grievances of the youth of my time. And this protest, they started strong, but I think barely 1 week later, this NSAS protest in Nigeria, they turned into some sort of musical festival where they were inviting youth to come and dance, and it became like a party instead of a protest. In the evenings, people will be selling jollof rice, they will be selling food. It became like a hangout center for youth to hook up, meet new dates. That was what that protest, that's what it ended up like. We contrast that with the Gen Z protests in Kenya, and it it ties to what Manasseh you said about making the lives of the 1% uncomfortable, where these protests were taken to the doors of the National Assembly, literally bringing the country to a standstill. And we see how we could see some effects. The president had to reverse some of his more unpopular policies, and then we could contrast it with what we saw in Nigeria, where the youth took a more friendly approach. And I think it boils down to what Martin was saying about the issue of youth civic education. It is okay to protest, but how do you protest? Do you protest as a means to hang out with your friends, or to ask the uncomfortable questions, or to make them feel, to pinch the shoe where it hurts? So these are some questions which I think we need to ask. We need to answer in the next questions. Now, how can these mass movement protests, how can they force those in power to face the consequences which they would have not have accepted otherwise? Because we saw that in Kenya, for instance, if these youths did not engage in the way they engaged, the state authorities wouldn't have faced the consequences, wouldn't have reversed course, wouldn't have reversed some of these unpopular policies. So we are now asking ourselves these questions. Aside this Kenyan example, if we could speak more to it, what happened in this mass movement from the Kenyan example, which forced those in power to face the consequences, which they wouldn't have accepted otherwise. And where others are falling short, for instance, like the NSAS, if you could give us instances where maybe this is where they went wrong, or maybe how could the Kenyan experience, how could it have even been improved better, such that this become a model for African youth, for the African generation, because protest is our human right. We have a right to protest. How can we protest? How can we organize ourselves in a way in which this mass movement, they force the government to accept the change which we, the people, if you're looking from the social contract, they rule at the request of we, the people. So if we decide to break the social contract, it is our inalienable human right to break the social contract. If we want to modify the social contract, we have a right to modify it. So how can we use to modify the social contract using mass movements in a way in which will force the agents, because the government are acting as on behalf of us, we the principal, they the agents. How can we use mass movements to force them to accept our wishes? And we could look at the Kenyan examples. We could now look at what helped, what did they do well, and we can look at maybe the Nigerian example, and we can look at the shortcomings and see what they did not do well. So, Martin, maybe you could just take us from this one, and then we come to Ahmed.
Okay, thank you, Babin, for that question. So, just getting indirectly to your question, I think what worked best for so just to give a little bit of context. I think the Kenyan protests have happened, I think, for the last 3 years. That's 2023, 2024, and 2025, and they've popularly been called Gen Z protests. Now, what brought about these protests was certain amendments within that were proposed in the current Finance Act. So there were amendments that were made in 2023, 2024, and even 2025. But of course, in 2023 and 2024, we saw youth were, I don't, not youth per se, but the common man, people on the ground thought that some of those amendments would make citizens pay a very heavy tax burden, and for the first time we actually saw these amendments actually being simplified by the youth themselves. So they got these bills. We do have a semblance of public participation, so they got these bills, and they did share their views with the legislators, and of course their views were never considered. And once they opted to pass this into law, then it left many youth and citizens with no option but to exercise their protest rights both online and offline. So they did this quite effectively through embracing the use of technology, through self-mobilization, and like we have never seen before, in Kenya's history. And we did see that in both instances. In the first instance, even after passing those repressive amendments into law, we saw the government backtrack and actually outrightly do away with the bill in both 2023 and 2024. We also did see an instance where a cabinet was dissolved, and albeit some of the same serving cabinet ministers broke back, but all this was as a result of sustained pressure by the youth. We did see, and I must say that this did not come without serious violations. We did see many youthful Kenyans, some of them cost them their lives. Over 2,500 were unlawfully imprisoned, but if you look at it collectively over the 3 years, there could be more than 3,000 who are unlawfully imprisoned and unconditionally released. And of course, some were disappeared. But specifically to your question regarding what they did to ensure there was some semblance of accountability. I must mention that not all the perpetrators of the violations that emanated during the youth protests have actually been held to account. We've only actually seen, can I say, a very few police officers here and there who have who were properly identified by it only took it took the youth to identify some of these officers and actually, put their names and details out there. And of course, we also saw the Independent Policing Oversight Authority and the other investigative agencies, effect investigations and commence prosecutions. But we also left in, of course, most of the youthful protesters have been left in an awkward situation where you are pursuing accountability. And I always like saying, the strange thing in Africa is that when you hear law enforcement agencies or when you hear investigators saying we're investigating, Bob and colleagues, investigations can go on for the next 10 years. When you hear people are being held to account, these cases drag on for quite an inordinate period of time, and sometimes they defeat, the very fabric of justice that is enshrined within our constitutions. But nonetheless, we have seen citizens not only in Kenya but also in other jurisdictions continue to demand for accountability for mothers who have lost their children. They have ensured that these perpetrators are actually held to account. And of course, they have explored different accountability mechanisms, both within our national courts, the different institutions mandated to exercise their mandate in terms of holding perpetrators of the violation in that context to account. And we've also seen a semblance of, albeit, can I say semblance, but not. We've seen the government make commitments, but also not coming to honor those commitments. And so probably the lessons I can say could draw from Kenya. I can't say in terms of accountability, I can't say we are there yet, because if you look at those who were unlawfully arrested, and those who were disappeared, those who lost their lives, we still the perpetrators are still walking scot-free, or some are, moving within the corridors of justice. Yes, waiting for their day, but that day does not seem to be coming. So, yes, those are a few lessons I think we can draw. But the pursuit for accountability is what resonates with the very many Kenyans and very many Africans, because it's within their rights to actually hold their governments to account. Because, like you rightly put it, governments are formed on behalf of their people. There exists a social contract, and if one party breaches that contract, then the other party is not at liberty to be, to be strung along by the breach. I mean, if you strung along onto the contract, despite an existential breach. So that is why we have seen citizens, I mean, the youth and citizens, not only in Kenya but in different parts of Africa, continue with their quest for accountability. So I will leave it at that for now and invite my colleague Manasseh to chime in. Thank you.
I would just briefly add that I think each country has its own context in terms of the rage, the anger, and the, what ultimately the way that their resistance is shaped. And so also in Kenya during the protests, we did see people coming together, singing, gathering, using non-violent forms of resistance to build people power and push back. So we also saw those traits in Tanzania, in Kenya. We've seen it in Nepal. So I don't think that just like a display of some song is necessarily a bad thing. It's also a form of resistance in itself. But I think figuring out that trigger of the one thing that actually unites people and can bring a lot of sub movements together is extremely important. I think one of the also learnings is looking at a multifaceted strategy. So how can you not only have a streets-based you need to be able to deal with like security and protection and care of those who are injured. You need to deal with a legal arm of your resistance, of your movement that's also pushing for legal accountability and justice and change. You need to look at sustained pressure. I think that it's difficult to say how different populations should react because their reaction is a product of their conditions. I wanted to actually take a moment to answer the question that came up in the chat. I don't know if that's, but I'll leave it to you. I see, Kathy, you also have your hand up to know
We can
whether
answer the
that's
questions after the presentations.
okay. We'll come to that at the
We'll have
end.
a question in the next session.
Sure. Back over to you for now. I think Martin did cover quite a lot.
Okay. Thank you so much. Manasseh, I'm still on you right now, and I just want us to just shed a little bit of light on the role of social media because we saw that social media was very, very, very impactful in both the NSAS protest in Nigeria, the Gen Z movement in Kenya, even with the Arab Spring, we see that social media is very, very important. But I think from my own perspective right now, I'm trying to marry social media right now with this very powerful disinformation campaign which is happening on the African continent. I think from my perspective, more African youth are moving more towards dictatorship because of a massive disinformation campaign which is happening on the continent. And I think that on its own is going to strangle the ideas of mass movements because if you're having a mass movement, we are rejecting the status quo. But I think more youth are being conditioned through social media to accept the status quo of dictatorship as legitimate. You look at what is happening in the Sahel region, and how do we marry this together? How can we leverage social media, or how can we combat disinformation to ensure that we have an undiluted mass movement which is founded on the aspirations of the people themselves?
Yeah, that's it's a very difficult question because as you mentioned and as we've acknowledged, the resources that come behind the state machinery to spread misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, character assassinations of those who are fighting for the people, and the way that people are actually so easily influenced and conditioned. It's extremely dangerous. And at the same time, I think social media and this culture of just scrolling means that you normalize a lot of violence, you normalize a lot of atrocities, corruption, scandals. We keep seeing in Kenya last year we saw 1.3 trillion stolen. If you actually quantify what that is, again this year another 1.3 trillion, 11 billion. So you're seeing violence all over. And it just kind of your brain and your ability to empathize and to engage, I think. And then you're seeing these propaganda machineries that are like unleashed and heavily resourced. As I've said in Kenya, the propaganda machines is one of the things keeping the economy afloat. Because as long as the political class can intentionally sustain poverty, that can be weaponized and it can be manipulated, whether it's in the form of PR and propaganda, whether it's in the form of organized violence. So we're seeing, a whole industry be created around disinformation, and it's very, very difficult for movements and the general citizenry to have a similar level of strength or a fair playing field when it comes to it. We do see the strength of social media in terms of rapid mobilization, coordination, mobilization across the whole country, messaging, poster dissemination. So we do see a lot of power within coordinated social media campaigns, and also the ability to document, to share, to amplify, to call out. So it does have a lot of power. And we're also now seeing a lot of laws being passed to try to silence, regulate, and criminalize freedom of speech. So it's a very dangerous kind of space at the moment. You can make a tweet, and in Kenya, you can now be hunted down in your rural home, taken, tortured, and disappeared because you sent a tweet that hurt somebody. And then they're simultaneously trying to pass laws that say if you embarrass someone, you can be held accountable. So there's no longer any freedom of speech that's retained. We're seeing new laws being passed, laws being manipulated, and simultaneously huge amounts of misinformation coming out of the government propaganda machine. So I think it's a very powerful tool and it's also a very dangerous tool. And unfortunately, we always have the lower hand in terms of not having similar resource to drive campaigns. There's a lot of potential with organic social media reach and organizing and capacity and conversations. But then it's all owned by, it's all businesses. And it's all also owned and influenced by the political class. So you can easily see social media platforms shut down in many countries, accounts deleted, not inability to access, which silences the truth. It silences the population. So it's a very solutions, I would say, like, I think there's a lot of solutions around how do we have people-owned media. At the moment, we've just seen the Nation Media Group be bought out by Rostam Aziz in East Africa, who's a big supporter of Ruto, who's a big supporter of Suluhu. So that's a huge part of our quote unquote independent media that's now been captured by a business political interest, which therefore continues to silence and influence the narrative. So as people, as individuals, as those within the space of technology, as civil society, how do we create our own platforms that we actually have ownership over, direction over? How do we consider also using AI and bots to counter disinformation in the same way it's being used to spread disinformation? So I think, again, all challenges also come with calls to action in terms of innovation and creativity, which is always met by challenges when it comes to resource, human resource, all resource. But I think it's extremely important as we see the civic space, the media space, the social media space closing down. We need to also be considering what alternatives are there for organizing, for spreading information, for amplifying the truth.
Thank you so much. Martin, would you have anything to add on this?
Thanks, Baban. And let me just pick up from where Vanessa's left. Yes, I must say that social media actually plays a very critical role, not for mass movements, but for all citizens, because we all use it for different purposes. I mean, it could even be argued that the political class do actually use these social media platforms, to freely express themselves, to organize, and to conduct their campaigns. But more specifically, when you look at there are just a few points that I want to make regarding the social media terrain. In not only in Africa, not in Kenya, but in Africa. The first thing we have to acknowledge, and like Manasseh rightly said, is most the political elites in Africa have learned how to capture social media spaces and or these media spaces to use them to their own advantages. And it is no wonder that in most African jurisdictions you find that most of the big media houses either are wholly owned by politicians or have politicians, having shares in these media houses, or are actually bought by, can I say, businessmen and women who actually have close ties with political elites. And what they do with these platforms is that they try to change the message or the narrative and try to change the view of many Africans. And that sometimes defeats the success of mass movements. The other bit is around the repressive legislations that are enacted from time to time, and Manasseh did touch on that. So earlier this year in Kenya, they came up with a unit within the National Police Service whose main task is to monitor how citizens use social media platforms. But the long and short of that is that is a surveillance tool that has not only been used by Kenyan authorities, but in different parts of Africa, albeit sanctioned within the different entities or done in a covert way to try to restrict, citizens from actually expressing themselves or airing out their views. Then there is the bit around tech accountability. You do realize that most of the social media platforms that most of us here use actually do have protocols that are actually supposed to hold those who spread, disinformation and misinformation accountable. But we have seen many of these big tech entities, and by extension, our mobile service providers held, operating with, with a huge level of impunity, whereby they are never held to account. And in many jurisdictions within Africa, these entities actually lack oversight mechanisms. So nobody holds, big tech, and by big tech, I mean X, Facebook. Just think of any platform that we use, or even the big service providers that do provide you with mobile internet services. And this and more importantly, the regulators within our jurisdiction, that is the communication authorities, have also abdicated their duties to hold, the service providers to account, whereby in certain instances we have seen service providers share out data that belongs to protesters, and that may explain why in certain protests in certain jurisdictions you're seeing protesters are able to be actually tracked and actually unlawfully arrested or disappeared. And it can only happen if your data, if your mobile phone data is related. So what we need to do, Barbara and colleagues, is we need to have a robust framework oversights within all African jurisdictions to ensure that big tech and mobile service providers are also held to account in the context of mass movements. But more importantly, our courts of law still remain, our last, point of call. For instance, in Kenya, we did actually file a case the Kenya Human Rights Commission did file a case challenging some of those repressive provisions that Manasseh had talked about that, had sought to give the state unfettered discretion to actually surveil on citizens. So as we speak, we have a progressive order that could enable citizens actually properly exercise their rights in the context of mass movements.
Okay, thank you so much, Martin. Thank you, Ahmed. In the meantime, if you've got any questions, please put it in the chat. We are almost done with the session, and we'll go to question and answer. And I think Mary has a comment to make, an addition. So, Mary, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, everyone. But I just want to talk about what was highlighted by Bobwin about the End SARS movement. So I just want to gently but firmly push back on the characterization of End SARS later becoming a festival, a jamboree. I would say that as a Nigerian, and as a person who also took part in the protest, that it's important that we are precise. So as we all know, the End SARS movement was a very serious youth-led protest that was done against police brutality, specifically against the Special Anti-Robbery Squad, which is SARS. And all of this, were well documented. There was the record of extrajudicial killings, torture and extortion, and some of this were already raised by Manasseh and Martin as, some of the reasons why people fail to protest or the mass movement does not end up being sustained. But I think one thing that we do not forget is the movement was met with lethal force, especially the Lekki toll gate on October 2020 rather, where the protesters were shot. And so I would say that yes, at some point, even though the protest was decentralized, it was well coordinated. So I do know that at some point the movement became chaotic in its later stages, but I would say that there are credible indications that the government actually sponsored hoodlums to infiltrate and hijack the protest in order to criminalize it. And once the movement was associated with looting and violence, it kind of lost both domestic and international momentum. So I would say that this is a very real and important lesson about the vulnerability of leaderless movements to deliberate sabotage. And so to say that, it was a jamboree, of course, I think it's something that the youth have always done, is to ensure that in as much as things are serious, they kind of make light of the situation. I think we've seen where things are happening, but you make cartoon characters or caricatures of presidents, of leaders to make light of the situation. I mean, but I think to say that to call it a jamboree or to call it a festival at whatever stage erases the dead. I think it erases the names of people like Victor Sunday Banga, Abuta Solomon, dozens of names that were named by the Lagos State Judicial, where a list of 48 people were listed as casualties. People were shot dead and suffered gunshot injuries. Some were assaulted by soldiers, and others were even listed missing and eventually presumed dead. There is DJ Switch, which I'm not sure if most people know her. She live streamed the events on the night of the Lekki toll gate of the killings, and she later fled the country. I would say that these are young Nigerians who went out singing the national anthem. I would not call that a jamboree. I would call that courage. And so, yes, the NSAS movement drew support from, the UN Secretary General, world leaders. It was taken seriously. I was part of the people who actually led the NSAS protest in Pretoria, South Africa, because there were different cohorts in different countries across Africa, some at home, some across Africa. And so I would say that the more honest critique and a legitimate one would be that the movement's demands were ultimately, I would say, too modest, and that the government lacked the political will. And that's something that was actually mentioned by Martin as well, the lack of political will to actually implement meaningful change. But I think that's a conversation that's worth having. But I would say that that is a different conversation altogether than completely dismissing the movement altogether. So I would say describing it the way you did, Bob Wynne, would trivialize the death and injuries of protesters, would undermine the credibility of human rights defenders, of academics and policymakers who are deeply familiar with the movement, and it also contradict the framing of our concept note, which was drafted, which actually treats NSAS as a legitimate example of mass movement demanding transitional justice responses. I would like to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary, for that clarification. Maybe we did not put it out well in terms of the concept note. The answers, like it was an example, but now we're trying to do some comparative study on maybe what went well here, what did not go well in the other side. And one of the drawbacks, I think, which without taking away the casualties, without taking away the death, or without taking away the essence of the movement, one of the criticisms of that movement, is even within the Nigerian academic space, was that one of the reasons why should I say, it lost its steam was that it was turned to a social media, like to dancing, and that's one of the reasons that not saying that it did not achieve some of its goals, even though they were minimal. Not saying that it wasn't a call for the youth to rise up. It wasn't a wake up call, but that was one of the activities which it took down its effectiveness, as I already said. And I thank also for really highlighting the. I think we did not mention it, the role of the government in hijacking such movements, in sponsoring talks, and we do not capture it. And I've just taken note of that. Before we go to the next, I'll just something that also come to my head aside from social media, aside from the role of the government. I think something which is very also concerning for our African context is the role of religious authorities in this. I think it just came to my head right now, and we look at, for instance, I think people are familiar with history. One of the causes of the Glorious Revolution was the divine rights of the king doctrine, where it was said that if you are unhappy with your king, the only thing you can do is to pray to God for God to change the king, but the king, you cannot do anything about it. And I think that has been heavily inscribed heavily welcome within our contemporary African societies, where even the leaders, the state leaders, they often quote the Bible to justify their continuous rule, stating that all leadership is put in place by God, and if you feel that your state is not answering to your needs according to the way you want, the only option you have is to pray or to go to the ballot. And we are also having religious leaders institutionalizing such dormancy within the at the state level, at the community level, encouraging youth to accept the status quo in with under the premise of allowing everything in the hands of God. God knows best. Let's pray. I think this is a really good concern for we as Africans to also recognize the role of religious leaders, religious movements, religious institutions in, should I say, helping, or should I say stopping the mass movement? So I would like us to go to the next. I think this is almost the last issue which we have to discuss. Is this the aspect of memorialization, community-based justice, and victim participation? So this is like very direct, and I would like to ask both panelists how mass movements have actually helped victims and survivors to get a seat at the table when justice processes have been designed. Is this possible? Can we see mass movements literally have this kind of outcome? And also beyond the courts and commissions, how have mass movements opened the door for communities to pursue justice on their own terms? So I want us to look at transitional justice from a perspective of community-based justice, from a perspective of memorialization, from these examples which we have been speaking about, the NSAS, the Gen Z protests, the Arab Spring. How have mass movements helped to put victims on the table to discuss this underlying grievances which orchestrated the movements themselves? How have these mass movements also helped with communities in terms of their healing, their memorialization, and their own communal accountability processes? Martin, if you could take this for us before we go to Manasseh. Thank you.
Thanks, Bobin, for those two excellent questions. Indeed, mass movements have, in one or another, directly or indirectly, contributed to enhanced community participation in these processes, or even memorialization. And what we've seen in the past couple of years is we have seen the youth in Kenya in different jurisdictions coming in to honor and just commemorate those that they have lost in the past. And that is one of I think that is one of the key. That's one of the. I must say that that's one of key themes within key frameworks within transitional justice, where memorialization is a way of ensuring that ensuring that some of these atrocities or violations are not committed in the near future. We have seen groups like the Mau Maus and those who fought for liberation from the yoke of colonialism actually memorialize, or commemorate certain days just as a day of remembrance of where they came from and how far they've come. So we have seen youth also embrace the aspect of memorialization, albeit in a unique way, whereby year in, year out, we have seen some activists actually document, put a face on the name of some of those who were either disappeared or who lost their lives in the context of these mass protests. And that in one way or another has encouraged more youth to actually participate in mass movements. So in one way or another, this is a way in which they've been able to ensure that that victims are actually memorialized. The other thing that we've seen youth be able to do effectively is we have seen, and of course through the media, is we have seen in different jurisdictions that different media, be it local or international media, have been able to document some of the stories, and through this, they've been still able to to keep the memories of those who paid the ultimate price for to liberate their own to date. So the media has also been instrumental in as far as ensuring that that mass movements embrace memorialization. But more importantly, the fact that in certain jurisdictions like Kenya, every year on the 25th of June, we see youth come together to commemorate, because that is we see them coming to commemorate those who have lost their lives in the struggle. So in that way, it becomes symbolic of commemoration. In terms of how they have ensure that youth participate in these processes, the communities participate in these processes, is the youth and by extension activists have played a critical role in trying to engage community members in terms of seeking justice and accountability and reparations from the governments of the day for atrocities or violations that have been committed. And we have seen them assist victims and survivors in a number of ways by trying to assist those to access different institutions that would help them pursue accountability. We have seen youth or civil society assist victims and survivors through legal representation in our courts of law. And they have been able to represent a number of youths who have been negatively impacted by the repressive and autocratic responses by some of by some of the regimes or some of the governments in Africa in the context of mass movements. And then we've also and then lastly we have also seen we've seen a semblance of where states have attempted to come up with truth or have attempted to come up with reparative mechanisms, but with no iota of, can I say, accountability. And I give a case study of Kenya where the government came up with, a panel, a committee or panel of experts to compensate those who lost their lives or who were violated in the context of the protests. Unfortunately, or fortunately, that panel of experts was since declared unconstitutional, as it does not meet the constitutional threshold, and the mandate for reparations is domiciled within the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights. So we have seen instances whereby, yes, governments want to pay out reparations to victims and survivors, but they do not want to dwell on the aspect of holding them to the whole aspect of who do we hold to account. And when that happens, then we risk having the same violations occurring again. As I conclude, Babin, I must say that I still insist. I think courts have played a very instrumental role in trying to ensure perpetrators are held to account, both within our national jurisdictions, within our regional courts, and even within our international courts, albeit the fact that they come with their hurdles. We have seen some progressive decisions issued by Kenyan courts in the recent past in terms of reparations for victims and survivors of violations. And I'll just mention in 2020 there was a landmark decision that was given for victims on sexual and gender-based violence. They were compensated to a tune of about $35,000, which was a landmark decision for being violated by law enforcement agencies in the context of the 2007-2008 post-election violence. So that in itself creates a progressive precedent in as far as holding the state to account or reparating victims and survivors is concerned. We're still grappling with the aspect of accountability, and I'm sure, like all of you in this webinar, it is our hope that one day we will be able to hold perpetrators of these serious human rights violations to account.
Thank you so much, Martin. I don't know if, Manasseh, so us. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Martin, for that overview. I think I would just add one thing, which I would respectfully disagree when you say governments do want to pay out reparations, but they don't necessarily want justice and accountability. I think we must also be aware of not giving credit where it's not due, because if you look in Kenya, for example, last year in 2024 June, there was a lot of very clear violence, extrajudicial killings, murder. All of this was being aired on TV, on social media, everywhere. And I think it was in July, the following month, where under immense pressure, Ruto came out and said, if I knew the names and the families and those who have been murdered, I will ensure take firm and decisive action towards accountability and compensation. So we actually made an appointment with the principal secretary together with victims, went to deliver a list of names which were already circulating and already clear, and were met with brute force and violence and the attempted abduction of Boniface Mwangi. And that was at a time where anyone who was speaking out was being disappeared, ending up dead in dams, in morgues. So I don't think there's any goodwill in terms of wanting to even acknowledge state-sponsored violence in times like this, much less create any victim-centered processes for healing, justice, or compensation. So I think it's a very difficult question around victims having a seat at the table, because there's been a lot of, in my personal experience, a lot of the work we've done has been with victims of families, both in Tanzania, Uganda, and Kenya. And it's difficult because they end up getting further targeted. Maybe they organize to go to a protest to even memorialize or commemorate, and they end up getting tear gas and bullets after going out to mourn their children. When we see in Tanzania, for example, victims coming forth in front of this broken commission, which is a commission designed by the executive, who's the same one who carried out, directed, and was the perpetrator of violence, her own commission to look into the violence she directed. And then you have victims coming in front of this body to give their testimonies, after which they're hunted down and disappeared to destroy evidence of the atrocities. So also you're seeing these really long drawn out processes where victims do try to find avenues for justice and for accountability through bodies like in Kenya, there's the Independent Police Oversight Authority, and their cases are drawn out for years and years, even the ones where there's clear video evidence, until the families themselves end up toppling into financial, medical, depression, all sorts of issues that are because of these long, sustained, drawn out processes that never bring any justice. So I think it's really important to continue supporting victims and ensuring that your approach is victim centered, but also there's a lot of significant challenges on families who are already grieving and mourning due to the backlash against them, even from when they're trying to, just have a voice or seek justice or follow up a court case. And there's a lot of lack of indignification of them and physical violence directed to them, as well as mental strain and emotional turmoil. So it's very important, but it's a very complicated space, as I would see. I think ultimately there's also a lot of desire to erase evidence and erase truth, which we're seeing in a lot of cases because of the lack of accountability and lack of justice, how that seemingly never will happen. And the more that these governments get away with mass atrocities and crime and violence, the more they become emboldened. If you look at Muhoozi, Museveni's son, for example, who is the chief of the army commander of Uganda, who can sit and tweet that he is torturing someone in his basement, who is actually actively torturing someone in their basement. And it's clear when they're later produced in court weeks later, all of that with impunity. So there's a emboldening of these authoritarian and violent regimes, and a really big gap when it comes to actual avenues for justice.
Thank you very much, Manasi. Martin, do you want to respond in 1 minute?
Thanks, Baban. I think the point I think both of us may have forgotten to mention, but I thought I should mention it as we conclude, is how can I say the political elite or the political oppositions have hijacked some of these mass movements. And I make reference to Kenya, where we saw then political leaders, hijack or reap where they have not sowed, better put. So in certain jurisdictions, we have seen opposition figures actually take advantage, or the political class take advantage of this mass movements, and that may explain why some of them have not been able to progress. I just thought I should mention that.
Okay, thank you. So final question. I think you have really worked on time, and this is the final question. And before we go to our question and answer session, I think most of us who have been on social media for some time, we have come across this meme where he says, "What you ordered versus what you got." So this question is loosely tied on that scenario. And so let's look at the full picture. We look at political change, truth telling, accountability, communal justice, reparations, all what you have. So where do you see the biggest gap between what people on the street are demanding and what they actually get up, what they end up with? Like, what is the biggest gap between what they ordered on the street and then what they got? What do you think is the biggest gap right now in contemporary Africa? So, Wanasa, you could take that first in 1 minute, and next, Martin will conclude with us before we go to our question and answer session.
What is the biggest gap? I would say the gap is actually 99% of the demands. If there's ever any demand that's met, it's tokenism. For example, in Kenya, there was a fire, the CSs, but they were just replaced with other incompetent political class who are just as bad as the ones before. So I think ultimately people are asking for quite simple things. They're asking for the ability to live dignified lives. They're asking for access to public services, water, healthcare, education, decent infrastructure, an economy that's conducive for employment, for business, for entrepreneurship. They're asking for the government to fulfill their basic mandates. So ultimately, I don't think people are asking for like luxury lives, but they're asking for dignified lives and access to their basic rights and fundamental freedoms. Do we have that? No, it's something that's a privilege for the select few. So I think there's a huge gap between the needs of the people and service delivery and the priorities of governance, which reflect their personal interests, their personal desires, their own accumulation of wealth, capture of all state resources, and the intentional sustaining of poverty and poor education systems so that the population can continue to be manipulated, so that poverty can be weaponized, and so the political class can maintain their own agenda. So I think there's a huge gap, and anything that we do get is generally tokenism.
Thank you, Martin.
Thanks, Baban. So I think the biggest gap, in my honest opinion, lies in three things. The first is political deception. Over the years, we have seen our political class master the art of deception, where, when they're caught between a rock and a hard place, then, like Manasseh says, you are promised heaven on earth. You are told heads will roll, people will be held to account, basically, can I say, flattery English or good use of English, and it all things would happen. But alas, we have seen that time and again that, when mass movements actually reach tipping points, whoever takes over, which is, probably can I say, a scion or somebody in close proximity with those who are already in power, they purport to attempt that we will deal with these ills, but they actually never get to deal with. So that is the first thing. So the political class have mastered the art of political deception and perception that poses a very serious threat to, progressive mass movements in the future. Now, the second one is, the lack of political will. And we have seen it time and again that, many of our politicians or many of the governments of the day, new or old, just seem to lack the will to actually serve their people with diligence. Just seem, they just seem to serve their own interests. And yet, when you look at the backdrop against which they got into power, as a result of, in certain instances where mass movements have played an instrumental role, then they reach there and they become so comfortable. So there is generally a lack of political will amongst the entire political class. But and last, of course, the constant breach of the social contract. Coincidentally, I always ask myself, and we have seen it. We have seen activists join politics, and you wonder where they lost their ethics, because somebody's been an activist for the last 15 years. Then he became a member of parliament, or was by certain fortune appointed to serve in cabinet, and it's like they were born with impunity. They did totally forget the values and virtues that they learned back then. So and that goes back to, the breach of the social contract. that comes with no consequence or iota of accountability. So, because these three elements cannot be, we can't get our political class to address these three elements. That is why time in, time out, we keep on, confronting the same issues. But not to say that not all is lost. I believe, we can have, there will come a time whereby we will have, progressive leaders. We will have, there will be a time whereby we shall hold these leaders accountable, because I always say nothing lasts forever. So that's where I'll leave it at. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martin. Thank you so much, Ahmed. I think from this last question, what I could get from you, if I could sum it up in one word, would be new patrimonialism, or the national cake politics, where the president or the state, they co-opt the opposition. I think there's one trending video from, I don't know, one East African country where a politician says corruption is bad, but if I benefit from corruption, I will defend it with my life. And I think it literally captures the sentiment you both have shared. So thank you so much, and for sharing your expertise with us. Now we'll open the question session. In the meantime, I'll read questions, but I think Mary had her hand up. So Mary, you have the floor. While I'll start reading the questions from the chat, and when I'm done with it, I'll ask anyone who has a question. Yeah, I can see Sikuru, your hand is up. After that, I'll give you the floor. But Mary, you have the floor.
That was an historical hand. So
Oh,
it's not recent, yes. So
okay,
proceed.
okay, sorry.
Thank you.
Okay, sorry. I think the first question. Where is my chat? Madalitso from Lilongwe, Malawi. Madalitso, it's nice having you. And she says, very insightful points from both Martin and Manasseh on the impact of mass movement in shaping transitional justice. But my question is, question is a little bit long. What should be the best strategy that mass movement networks can take to make sure their struggle is not only attached to fighting one person, but the rest of the system? Okay. My observation is that mass movements mostly focus on removing one person, in this case, a president or a leader, but there is no struggle for the system to change too. Could it be that mass movements are more comfortable with just fighting against an impunitive leader over a whole system responsible for its suffrage? This is very important. So who would like to have a first bite at this?
I can go, Baban.
Okay, sure.
So
Go.
yes. And both questions sound similar. I think in order for I think like I earlier submitted, I think mass movements, once they are successful, they must ensure, or first and foremost, we have to have a broad discussion around transition. And by transition, we don't mean that when you get rid of, or when you successfully take out the oppressors of today, then we don't hold them to account. So first and foremost, they must be in a framework in which, a transitional framework, and whichever leaders that will take over, will take over the reins of leadership as a way to exercise, as a way to exercise our constitutional right, must ensure that that the political elite or class who are committing violations are held accountable. Secondly, I think we also have to have, legal policy and structural reforms within the governance architecture of any jurisdiction after a successful mass movement. And that is primarily because some of the existing structures or laws or policies have created a conducive environment for oppressors to continue oppressing us. If we have a weak judiciary, it simply means that we cannot try, a former perpetrator of serious human rights violation. He would defeat all of us through the justice systems. If we have legislators who are not making sound or progressive pieces of legislation, then you will have a reoccurrence of the same violations or same atrocities by the new actors in place. So you need a radical kind of reform within key institutions. Then we also need to, I also think we need to come up with robust oversight mechanisms. I did speak about, the aiders and abettors of these violations on online platforms are big tech companies, but they keep going away, nobody gets to hold them to account. So maybe it's about time we had that discussion, how do we hold big tech or big mobile service providers accountable in the context of mass movements and transitional justice, especially whereby they are directly or indirectly aiders and abettors of some of the violations that we continue seeing. Yes, so I will leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Manase, anything to add before there's a question for you, but do you have anything to add on this?
Yeah, I think that also I agree it's hugely important. I think there's multiple layers. One is we're looking at global like geoeconomic interests. So as Martin started to touch upon, we also have all of these interests of not only the individual who is quote unquote in power, all of the financiers, all of those who benefit from their access, all of those who get awarded these huge tenders, everyone who has their own foreign regional interests in certain assets within the respective country. So we're not only up against this individual, but also all of those other interests. So how do we start to break down the pillars of support? How do we deal with, as Martin also touched upon, the institutional rot? So one is, I think, it can become difficult because a lot of times, how do you balance reactiveness and strategic efforts? If you have new laws, new bills, flooding, devastation, extrajudicial killing, disappearances. We had one of our close colleagues abducted the other day in Kenya by Tanzanians and Kenyans working together. We have to respond to that. So how do you balance strategy and reacting to crisis? And they're intentionally keeping you on your knees in terms of new curveballs, new headlines, new atrocities, new scandals daily. So it can be difficult to actually build like longer term strategic strategies which really look at breaking down these pillars. We've been talking about it in Uganda. There is zero judiciary. The judicial, function is just completely under the wing, under the influence of the executive. So how do you start dealing with that larger problem while trying to find the people who have been disappeared for weeks, months, and who are in remand for 5 years? So how do you balance institutional overhaul and like attacking this larger monster while also dealing with the people that you can immediately see as your problem? So I think also the fact that we are kind of conditioned and to not be able to dream anymore, to not see an alternative. We continue to see the same patterns repeating themselves of corruption, of bad governance, of incompetence, of lack of people-driven policy and action. So where I think we also, our ability to dream of something better and different and drastically different is also suppressed. So we focus on the problem rather than the solution. And I think it's not wrong to also see these people as your direct targets because they are responsible for certain injustices and the perpetuation of it. But ultimately, as Boniface Mwangi says a lot, like when there's rot in the head, it's going to continue to affect all of these different branches. There's a lot of nominated positions that are brought in through this executive power. So if you can also transition at a higher level, it can really influence accountability through state institutions, state branches, independent institutions, and like the police force, all of security agencies that are directly influenced by that executive. So I don't think it's about comfortability. I think it's rather also about capacity in terms of being able to deal with these larger structural issues as well as the ongoing current day challenges. I hope but it doesn't mean we're not trying and that we can't use all the support we can get in terms of insights, thoughts, human resource. So I think it's also a call to action to continue getting more involved and seeing how you can be a part of the solutions and the gaps that you identify within movements. Thank you.
The last question on the chat for you, Manasseh, before we go to our friend who has his hand up. And I think it's very closely related to what you've been saying about the conditioning of the mind. And someone asks, what's your take on the misleading news outlets in the wake of mass movement in fight for justice? And I think this is it also ties with what you have been saying earlier on the state capture of media outlets and within the broader institution itself. So we are now having to challenge the system with the tools of the system. And as the famous writer Audre Lauder said, the master's tools can never be used to dismantle the master's house. So based on that, what is the best major strategy that masters could take for an effective struggle without compromise?
That's a very difficult question.
Very, every for me is difficult.
First, I would say I don't think it's a bad thing that there's mixed tempers. I think we need to also be okay with different people's perspectives, ideas, calls to action. We cannot control the masses. We're not trying to be dictators or authoritarian leaders. So I think it's okay to have differing opinions from even within the struggle. Ultimately, I think it's about finding the points of synergy and alignment between different elements of the movements to see where you guys do align and what can be points of unity that can strengthen the people's voice and the people's direction.
walilipa paskedi ba.
Sorry.
Salut.
No, continue. Sorry.
What's the best media strategy that masses would take? Ultimately, I think like our strength will continue to remain in our capacity. We saw a lot of power when it came to documentation, collection of evidence, collection of videos, collection of photos, and disseminating that through mass media channels because they have a lot further reach than our individual accounts. But I think it's about what is the objective at the time. So movements go through various phases. Is it a smear campaign? Is it public naming and shaming? Is it memorialization? Is it amplification of truth? Is it mobilizing for action? And I think building allies and building strength in multi-platform spaces is really important. A lot of the working class and a lot of the population isn't on X. They're not on webinars. They're not on Instagram. They're maybe on WhatsApp. So how do we get into different grassroots levels and forms of communication also, but depending on our objective at the time. So I think that would have to guide the answer is what's the objective at the time, and then how do we diversify and harness different strategies to be able to succeed. And as Bobwin very, importantly said, and as I raised earlier, we are using the oppressor's tools. So what else can we do? There's a lot of innovation happening in the world today. How can we also be more innovative in creating our own platforms that we can control to be able to have better control over narrative and communication systems and structures?
Thank you, Manasseh. Martin, anything to add? We are about 10 minutes to the end. Martin, anything to add?
Yes, I think so. On my end, I think what I must say is, Urban colleagues, is that I mean, it's my honest opinion that we can't have an Africa whereby mass movements contribute significantly to regime change and the broader transitional justice conversation. I am one of those optimistic people that always feel like we will get to hold people to account. We will get to see a different form of governance that clearly mirrors what the social contract expects of us, what our constitutions, or even what our different regional frameworks expect of servant leadership. Of course, it's my hope that in the near future we would see more robust legal systems, because like Manasseh earlier mentioned, many of some of these regional courts, we don't, victims and survivors of mass atrocities do not have, can I say, do not have a lot of faith in these courts. A good example is when you look at the ICC, the ICC and the Kenyan cases. All the 6 cases that were filed before the ICC collapse. But as we speak, we did see, in that context of mass movements, that 1,200 Kenyans lost their lives. There were massive displacements, and not only in Kenya, but we've also seen in other jurisdictions whereby those charged with crimes against humanity have not been able to be held to account. So it is my hope that that we see more robust and effective regional courts, more bold and more bold national courts that can be able to push the accountability and reparative agenda forward. Yes, so I'll leave it at that for now.
I've just shared a chat from Wanase she's communicating that for those who would wish to stay in touch with her, should find her through email. I've put it in the chat. It's up for everyone to please. And she's also active on LinkedIn as she's on the streets.
Not as
Okay.
active in LinkedIn as on the streets, but you can still find me there.
Okay. Sikuru, I think you could take the last question for us before we invite Mary Zobo, the program manager for the advocacy department, to close us off. Sikuru, I think you are permitted.
Ok, bonjour. Bonjour.
Bonjour.
Ok, moi c'est Claude Moisy. Je suis de l'organisation No Violence Alerte. C'est une organisation basée en RDC qui travaille aussi sur la justice transitionnelle. Merci pour les activistes du Kenya, pour ce que vous faites, pour toutes les démarches que vous faites de la justice transitionnelle. Vraiment, c'est une bonne chose. Et aujourd'hui, nous avons constaté que les réseaux sociaux sont des facteurs primaires qui peuvent plus avoir beaucoup de masse, parce que nous l'avons essayé en 2012 avec le mouvement citoyen RDC. Nous avons travaillé avec le mouvement citoyen Lucha dans la lutte contre les élections. Et en 2018, oui, nous l'avons eu, mais on ne l'a pas eu de la manière dont on voulait. Le mal que nous avons constaté beaucoup de jeunes qu'on a milité avec eux. Après, après avoir milité plusieurs années avec eux, on a constaté qu'ils se sont transformés en politiciens et ils oublient toute la base de notre élite. Et ça a été une déception totale. Et aujourd'hui, nous pensons que le mouvement des masses, nous devons changer notre approche dans la lutte. Et à part l'approche, nous devons être plus aussi professionnels et avoir aussi, dans notre mouvement de masse, avoir aussi des juristes qui peuvent entamer des procès, qui peuvent entamer de démarches juridiques pour nous faciliter la tâche, pour nous faciliter les choses. Parce que nous avons constaté que malgré on fait des marches, mais sur le plan juridique, on nous harcèle matin, midi, soir, vu que sur le plan juridique, ils ne sont pas outillés. Donc, la justice transitionnelle est bon si nous tous nous sommes aussi outillés. C'est ça, c'est qui est mon intervention pour cette formation. Merci vraiment pour les organisateurs et merci pour votre intervention. Merci.
Manessa has a hard stop in 3 minutes time, so if we could allow her have a bite at this question before we come to you, Mathieu.
Désolée, mais je parle juste un petit peu de français, alors il faut traduire. Sorry,
okay,
I
yes.
don't speak much French.
So again, he was talking about the mass movements whereby in Congo, which were led by you. Were using social media as a tool and everything, but then some of them were co-opted by the government. And once they were co-opted by the government, they forgot about like the guiding principles of why they were pushing for the change in the first place. So how do you think we could address this from our perspective, and how do you think we could leverage social media to ensure that these youth stand for our voices once they get to these positions?
Thank you. It's a very difficult question. I hope it's okay that I answer in English. Is the translation service working?
Translation is working. Translation is
okay.
working.
It's a very difficult question because as long as poverty is also a big factor and economic challenges, it means that a lot of people will also be driven by their own needs once they get into positions of power. And I think it's very easy to co-opt, and that's why poverty is sustained, so that it can actually be bought out and manipulated and used to serve the political interests. So it can be very difficult. I think that's a challenge across many spaces. I think also looking at like civic and political education, not just civic, but political, where we look at these tokenism, whether it's 500 shillings or $5 for a vote, and then 5 years of suffering under a leader who actually does not care about you. So how do we balance the ability to potentially take what you get because it's your own services, it's your own taxes, or refuse it so that you can actually choose leadership that believes in people? So I think using social media to spread information, to share political education, civic education in ways that actually resonate to the target demographic is really important. It's not speaking from a constitutional NGO perspective, but speaking a people's language in the way that they'll resonate and understand, and having their own peers also doing the same. So we're building a culture of information sharing, of challenging popular thought, and of trying to deconstruct the brainwashing and the ability to be coerced and bought out. Simultaneously, we need to look at economic solutions, because as long as we don't have the ability to provide for ourselves, provide for our families, we are going to take what's in the best interest of our families on many occasions. Some people like me, I wouldn't take billions for anyone, but how do we also build stronger local economies so that we can deal with that level of need while also using civic and political education to try to influence decision, and making sure that the representation we put forward actually has a track record of serving their people. So we need to be looking for people to represent us who have historically been doing good and been focusing on people-centered agendas.
Thank you,
So
Ahmed. Martin, can you please
I
close us
think I'll
in?
leave it there. As mentioned, I just have another meeting at 2 o'clock, but thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me to
Thank you
CSVR
for having
for the
us.
work you do. Thanks, Martin, and to all of the audience as well.
We'll keep in
Thank
touch
you.
very soon. We are literally 4 minutes out. So, Martin, if you could round up in 1 minute for
In
us.
less than 1 minute,
Yes.
yes, yes. First and foremost, I would like to thank the CSR team for having me for this important webinar, to our listeners for the excellent questions, and of course to you yourself, Baban, for the excellent moderation. I look forward to more engagements with all comrades on the call, and yes, let's continue fighting to make Africa a better place. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martin. Sikuru, I don't know if you captured what the last panelist was saying, mais elle disait on utilise la pauvreté maintenant dans les États pauvres. On utilise la pauvreté pour faire que quand les gens, on les nomme dans les positions en haut, la jeunesse, ils devront même oublier ce qu'ils barraient pour dans la même première. Mais maintenant, on doit rédiger les causes racines. On doit d'abord rédiger les causes racines, c'est-à-dire on doit amener tout le monde hors de la pauvreté. Quand on va amener tout le monde hors de la pauvreté, on peut commencer maintenant à nommer la jeunesse sans avoir peur qu'ils vont nous trahir. And I think that I hope Sikuru had that message. And I'll give the floor to Mary Izobo, the Advocacy Program Manager of CSVR, to give us a closing remark before we leave. In the meantime, thank you for having me so much. And until next time, Mary.
Thank you so much. Dear panelists, participants, and colleagues, it's sad, but we've arrived to the end of what has been a truly rich and substantive conversation. Allow me to take a few moments to actually reflect on what we have heard, that continues to leave us with a shared sense of purpose. I would say that today's conversation has actually reinforced a fundamental point, right? That mass movements in Africa are not spontaneous eruptions of disorder. They are actually very structured. they are very purposeful, and they're actually deeply rooted in the lived experiences of people who have actually exhausted other avenues for change. During a conversation for the panelists, they spoke about the Gambian experience, the Burkina uprising, the Arab Spring, NSAS, even the Sudan revolution. I would say that one common thread that has emerged is that this movement arise where governance has failed. This movement arise where rights have been denied and where the distance between the governed and those who govern have grown very unconscionable. We've also heard clearly from the from the panelists, the role of social structures, both traditional networks, digital platforms. We spoke about the role of social media and how this role cannot be underestimated. These are not just merely tools of communication. We've seen how social media has actually advanced some of these movements. So we cannot just say they are tools of communication. They are actually should I say, a piece of solidarity. They are what actually have transformed individual grievance into collective action. And so perhaps most critically, I would say that our discussions have illuminated the fragility of the moment between movement and justice. And that's something that was also highlighted by Manasseh and Martin, that the fall of a government or the end of a repressive regime does not automatically inaugurate a just order. We see that in Burkina Faso, we see that in Sudan, we see that even in Nigeria. A lot of these have been were raised during the conversation. But there's also the risk of counter evolution. There's also the risk of elite recapture, and there's also institutional inertia, which is ever present. And so, justice mechanisms must be designed with with reality in mind, right? And so to look at it, to look forward, I would say that transitional justice, truth telling, I think it was Martin who talked about a People's Truth Commission and using it to hold our leaders accountable, or actually even civic education for youths, and how we can use that for them to be able to show interest in how their countries are governed. And so we've seen that there is that need for reparations and accountability and institutional reform, being some of the most powerful frameworks we have for bridging the gap between when a government has collapsed, between when we're trying to renew the government. But I would say that it's not only as powerful as the political will that sustains it, but also popular legitimacy that actually undergirds it. And so what today has also shown in our conversation, which has been very, very interesting, I would say, is that mass movement must not be seen as the spark that ignites transitional justice processes. We must all be active participants in shaping them. And I think one question that arose when Manasseh was speaking was, why are this protests not being sustained? And that's a question that I would like to leave us much later for food of thought, to say that whether the communities that take to the street, the young people that takes to the streets, old people that takes to the streets, researchers that write, I would say that everyone needs to sit at the table. And without that, I would say transitional justice risk becoming another instrument of exclusion, which we often dressed in the language of healing. And so I would say that for civil societies that are present here today, our role does not end when the protests subside. Our role continues. We must continue to monitor, we must continue to advocate, and we must continue to document, because that's actually what makes it go from unsustained to sustained. The same thing for our policymakers. I would say that the challenge is to continue to build institutions that are responsive to popular pressure without being destabilized by it. And I think that's one of the questions that Madaliso had asked, to talk about what happens when we topple one person, leaving the institutions that actually continue to support that one person. So institutions can hold perpetrators accountable while creating genuine space for victims to be stored and heard. When we look at the intellectual traditions, we look at Fanon, we look at Steve Biko, we look at Mbembe, what they actually remind us is that knowledge production itself is a political act, and we must continue to tell our story. And so I would like to express sincere gratitude to our distinguished panelists, Manasseh and Martin, for your depth, your generosity, your candor, I would say, that has actually brought life to this conversation, that has actually made it very interesting. Your expertise has genuinely enriched this conversation. And it's funny because Martin, you and Manasseh actually have been victims, of the government in your strife as you continue to speak up against all of this ills of the government. But I think aside that, you've actually left us with new perspective and very practical insights. And to our moderator, Dr. Bobwin, thank you for stemming the ship to bring about a very productive webinar. And for Ahmed, our translator, I'm not sure if he's still here. Oh, he's still here. And thank you, because I mean, it takes 2 hours to keep talking nonstop. But also thank you to every participant who has joined us today, those who've asked questions, those who's challenged assumptions, and those who simply listened and reflected. I would say that in a world that moves very fast and often where it often rewards noise over substance, choosing to spend 2 hours in this thoughtful webinar, I would say is an act of commitment to the work. But I would like to leave us with a final word. And that's the same question that keeps resonating in my mind. How do we sustain mass movement from dying down, regardless of the horrors that come with it, whether it's torture, whether it's enforced disappearance, whether it's violence, threats? I mean, we see how sadly Brian Kagoro was sent back, from Kenya to South Africa, only because he continues to speak truth to power. And I think it's the same thing that Martin has suffered. And the question is, how do we sustain this mass movement? How do we not make it die down? The young people have been filling the squares, have been filling the streets of our cities. We look at it from Kenya to Tanzania, even to Nigeria. And they are demanding justice. We are demanding justice. And I would say that this is not something that we should aspire to do in future, but this is our present reality. And I would say it falls on each and every one of us in our respective roles, whether as advocacy managers, advocacy specialists, EDs, wherever we are, whoever we are, to respond with the urgency, honesty, and courage that this moment demands. So I would say that as we leave this webinar today, or this virtual space, I would say that we do not leave just being informed or having new insights to the topic, but I would say that let us move to act. Let us move to advocate. Let us move to build the just societies that Africans have always deserved. Thank you very much. Asante Sana, Merci, and Siabunga. Thank you very much. Back to you, Bobwin.
Thank you, my boss. Okay, everyone, bye. And until next time, please let's connect, reach out on LinkedIn anytime, anywhere. We're ready to engage with you. Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, everyone. And until next time, bye.
Thank you, Bobin. Thank you, colleagues. Bye for now.